The river took him so fast, I swear I saw the water make a decision. One moment Max was bounding along the bank, a German shepherd with sunlight stitched into his fur. The next his paws had punched through the brittle skin of foam edging the current, and the world narrowed to the sound of water, speaking in a language older than breath. His collar flashed once, a silver blink, then the river bit it, heaved, and he was in, head up, eyes wide, the canine logic in them collapsing into something like human panic. The air smelled like cold iron and willow bark, and my legs were already moving before thought put on its shoes. Downstream, driftwood turned into meteors. The water didn't flow, it lunged. It didn't ask, it took. I heard myself call his name, and it sounded small, a match lit in a wind tunnel. Max thrashed, vanished, surfaced again, front paws churning for something to press against. Something that wasn't there. Sunlight slid off the surface like oil. The current carried the dog I loved into its throat, and I understood, with a clean, precise terror, that any life is always one decision away from becoming a story someone tells with their hands shaking. Show your love. Hit like, share, and subscribe for more. The Pull. The chapter opens with an ordinary late afternoon by a monsoon-fed river outside a small town, the light clean as a blade. Max is all joy and stubbornness, fighting the leash while I let him wander the wet reeds. We are alone until a fisherman nods from a distance, the only witness to casual happiness. Then the ground gives a little under Max's weight, a soft betrayal. He slips and the bank crumbles, the river pretending to be as still as a polished stone until it isn't. Panic is fast and clumsy, guilt is slower and sharp. I move without thinking, shoes heavy, the smell of silt thick in my throat. The story tilts. A rope appears in my hands as if conjured. Memory produces it from the trunk of the car, a leftover from a move. I am angry at myself for the slackness of joy, for letting him too close. The chapter ends with Max spun into a swirl of white and green, his head barely above, and my foot hits the water. Cold turns my skin into glass, and the river teaches me humility by the mouthful. The rope cinches my waist. I grab a broken root and slide anyway, downstream where Max surfaces, where his ears slick back into triangles of fear. A stranger shouts orders, a truck driver, a woman in a red shawl. Suddenly the world is full of a small community of urgency. Max's claws hook on my forearm, blood opens in a bright, ridiculous flower, and I take his weight. The current is a hungry animal and we are 2 pulses inside it. The bank is a rumor. The rope bites me until I know the shape of my own bones. Grip, release, grip again. We pinball between rocks. I learn the geometry of rescue: stay low, angle into the flow, make yourself a lever. The chapter ends when the river's roar lifts into the open vowel of salvation. Hands catching the rope, my knees finding mud. Max coughing river back into the river. The long night, the body remembers what water did to it. Max trembles with a shiver the world cannot see, an aftershock that rattles through fur into my palms. We wrap him in towels and words. The vet is an hour away, our local clinic is closed, our living room becomes an emergency ward built out of blankets and intention. I rub his paws until heat thinks about returning. His eyes track me like moons. I confess to him like he understands. I'm sorry, I'm here. Neighbors bring a hairdryer, a thermos of tea, advice passed from older men who read weather in their knuckles. The house smells like wet wool and gratitude. Through the window, the river keeps going, tireless as regret. I study the rise and fall of Max's chest until dawn files a quiet report. We have made it through something. The chapter closes with sleep coming for both of us like a gentle tide. The second drowning 3 days later, Max is walking again, eating, even scolding pigeons with his restored indignation. Relief feels like freedom until night coughs remind me that the river leaves signatures inside lungs. He stops mid-drink, sways and the floor tilts. His breath is an accordion with a broken rib. The old vet answers on the second ring and tells me about aspiration, about water hiding in alveoli like spies. We drive through rain that looks like 1,000 needles. The highway is stitched with hazard lights. The clinic is a white island. Oxygen hisses from a machine. Max's chest learns the old choreography again. The vet's hands are calm, mine are not. We wait in a room where the walls are too smooth, futures too loud. The climax is not a rescue, not exactly, it is a choice. How much intervention, how much hope, how to understand suffering without turning away. The chapter ends with the needle's tiny prick, the medicine his quiet road, and Max leaning his forehead into my wrist like a benediction. When the river lets go, recovery is less a moment than a landscape you cross step by step. Max breathes easier under a sky polished by the storm's exit. The river has softened back into a road of light, pretending innocence, but we know its other face. Weeks later, we walk there again, not to tempt fate but to let memory close without locking. The dog who almost died learns a new command: stay, and I learn the more stubborn command addressed to myself: forgive. We stop at the place where mud slicked out from under his paws and wild mint grew from a scar in the bank. The fisherman nods again. The story circles back to where it began, altered the way glass is changed by fire. The final image is simple and whole. Max sits. The current speaks in a lower voice, and the leash lies slack between us like a quiet truce. I don't remember stepping off the bank so much as being ordered by something older than fear to be in the water. Cold inserted itself into my bones with bureaucratic efficiency, filing paperwork in triplicate, stamping every nerve ending with its seal. The rope around my waist was a crude promise I had made to myself, the knot bit like a teacher's correction. Max surfaced 6, maybe 7 arm lengths downstream, his head doing little circles of panic, as if he could draw a small calm pond around himself by tracing it. His ears were flattened, his eyes huge, the whites showing. I shouted his name and the river took the syllables and turned them into froth. The ground under my feet wasn't ground at all. It had the moral flexibility of silt. I fell, caught, fell again, my shins striking rocks that were more intention than object. A truck had stopped on the dirt road above. A woman in a red shawl ran, lifting her hem in one hand, the other already reaching toward the rope like we had rehearsed this in a life before this one. "Angle! Angle your body!" someone yelled, and I remembered some half-watched video about crossing a stream face upstream, become a wedge, let the water go through you. It's ridiculous what the brain retrieves when the world is trying to erase you. Max went under. The second his muzzle disappeared, the river changed temperature, as if panic had heat. I counted without deciding to 1, 2. He rose again, expelled water in a coughing bark that sounded like a lie told by lungs. He tried to swim head-on against the current and made the mistake that all of us make in stronger rivers, believing that will is a physics. I pushed toward him, shins and knees bargaining with unseen shelves and stones, the rope paying out in damp, jerking increments. The woman in the red shawl braced herself around a willow trunk and looped the line twice, a move I would later replay in slow motion, grateful for the unasked for skill. The river tugged me like a parent in a hurry. I arrived at Max the way you arrive at a decision, all at once and with injury. His claws found my forearm and opened it like an envelope. Bright blood wrote its brief letter in cold water. We collided. He wrapped himself around me with the despairing intimacy of the drowning. Every instinct in him said climb, find height, reach for a boat that does not exist except in the desperate physics of panic. I took hold of the collar. I took hold of his scruff. I talked to him the way you talk to a child you love while the house burns. You're okay. I'm here. I have you. Breathe. Do this with me. The sound of the river grew and grew until it wasn't sound. It was weather inside my head, a constant moving roof. We ricocheted off a half-submerged stump, and for a moment I saw the entire day if I failed the gap in the leash, the empty back seat, the bowl on the kitchen floor that would hold water for no one. Dug my heels into the riverbed and found nothing but the ordinary compromises of gravel. Life does not guarantee purchase. The line went taut and then tauter, a word stretched until it almost lost meaning, and then we moved backward like a film of falling played in reverse. Hands arrived from the bank, hands that smelled like engine grease and cumin and earth, hands that had built houses and fixed things and carried children. A man I had never met wrapped his arm under mine and swore softly in the patient tone of a prayer. We slid onto mud that welcomed us with that obscene kiss only mud gives. Max was heavy with water, which is to say he was exactly as heavy as the world that had tried to keep him. He coughed again, those painful, ringing coughs that sound like the body reading instructions to itself on how not to die. We built a small infirmary by instinct. Someone brought blankets from the cab of their truck, the kind with cartoon animals that meant they had a child. We created a windbreak with our bodies, the woman with the red shawl taking one side, the truck driver the other, and me kneeling with Max's head in my lap, stroking him like the motion could undo physics. His eyes flicked around, not quite landing on me, as if the world was still in motion and couldn't be pinned to a single face. He was trembling so violently it seemed like the quaking of an animal twice his size and age. Shock looks private from the outside. Inside it feels like someone rewired your heart to a different clock. The driver produced a flask. The woman produced a towel that smelled like sun. The towel wicked river away like it had an opinion. We wrapped Max, cocooned him, and the tremors slowly traded magnitude for duration, smaller, longer, less jagged. I have never been good at prayer in the formal sense. My prayers tend to happen with my hands. I rubbed his paws until the pads warmed and the nails clicked again when they touched the edge of the stone. I pulled on his ears gently to get blood moving. I spoke to him as if he were a man who had returned from war. His breath smelled metallic and green, a garden after rain layered over iron shavings. His tongue lolled, then corrected itself, tidied back into his mouth, as if embarrassed by its own looseness. The woman in the red shawl told me about her childhood dog, how he would sit beside her father on a charpai and lean exactly the same amount every night. She made this small, soft circle of talk around us, an orb that kept the wind suspiciously at bay. I told her Max's habits, how he refuses to pass a puddle without stepping in the exact middle of it, how he sleeps with one paw dramatically thrown over his snout like a man in a silent film. This is how people resist panic, by listing particulars. By the time we reached the car, the sun was low, a coin rubbed thin. In the rearview, Max watched me with the particular solemnity animals save for when the world wobbles. We drove with the heat up and the windows cracked to leave a slit for the river to leave by. At home I built warmth around him out of towels and hair dryers, not of breathing and promises. The house smelled like an apartment where a winter coat has been sweating. Night rearranged the furniture of my awareness. I dozed on the floor with one hand inside Max's ruff, so that if he decided to leave again, even for a small walk into the bad neighborhood of unconsciousness, I would know. He slept with the fragile determination of someone who understands on a cellular level that sleep is trust. Around 3 in the morning he dreamed, bark, those tiny muffled barks like bubbles rising in syrup, and his front paws paddled at the air. I whispered his name and the dream let him go. We were not done with the river. 3 days later he'd reclaimed his bossiness, his small tyrannies. He pushed his bowl at me with a proud thunk, as if the river had not recently put us both in our place. That evening, after he'd chased a stubborn pigeon up and down the courtyard, with a stiffness in his joints that made me both laugh and ache, he coughed. It was nothing at first, a throat clear the way a dog corrects a hare. Then the cough returned, low and wet. He stood up and swayed, and I felt in my sternum that old elevator drop. Lungs can keep secrets. I watched his sides for the rise and fall and saw a hesitating metronome. Panic does not enter through the mind. It arrives through the breath. I called the old vet whose number is written in felt, tip on the scrap of paper on the fridge that also lists coriander and light bulbs. He answered with sleep still on his voice and said the word I had half remembered from some article aspiration. Water can sit quiet inside a body and then claim rent later. Come, he said simply. Now, the highway was a tunnel threaded with rain. Hazard lights glowed like insects caught in amber. Max lay on the back seat with his head lifted high, as if the angle itself were a medicine. I drove with my right hand on the wheel, and my left stretched back to touch his shoulder. He took my fingers between his teeth once, a gentle hold, the way he did as a puppy when he wanted to be sure I was listening. The clinic was all white and purposeful light, the kind of place where hope learned to balance on fact. The vet's hands were old and clever. An oxygen mask looked ludicrous on a face that had grinned through storms, but he accepted it with a dignity that made my throat close. Machines spoke a language of green lines and soft beeps. I watched numbers pretend to be meaning and then become meaning, because there was nothing else to hold on to. The vet explained in phrases that were both blunt and kind fluid, inflammation, the risk that what we saw was only the visible part of what the river had done. I signed papers with a hand that had not stopped shaking since I'd seen that first cough open like a cut inside the room. They gave him an injection that would tell his lungs to calm down, to stop trying to do all the work with panic as their supervisor. I traced a circle on the top of his head with my thumb and felt the heat of him, reliable and enormous. He leaned into me, put the flat of his forehead against my wrist exactly where the river had written its red cursive days before, and the old scar, to be sang briefly with the memory. So much of loving anything is made of waiting rooms at clinics, at the foot of a bed, at the edge of a decision. I sat in a plastic chair with a crack in it and thought about all the things I had not known I could lose. The vet came in and told me what I already felt in the way the room had softened. He was responding. He wasn't out of the woods. The phrase always made me think of wolves that no longer live in ours. But he had found the path. We learned to measure progress in teaspoon units. He ate a little, drank less, slept with that anxious half-listening sleep you see in new parents and old warriors. He breathed as if remembering, and I discovered the human torture of counting breaths, of trying to hear if a second is longer than a second. He got better the way grass grows silently and visibly, then all at once obvious. One morning he stood, shook himself, and in that ordinary seismic shiver the house changed weather. He nosed my pocket where biscuits hide. I laughed in a voice that sounded like mine again. We walked outside the clinic into air that had been washed and hung neatly back on its line. The vet nodded once, a benediction granted and accepted. I would like to say I learned something grand right there, a lesson with edges and a title. But what I learned was smaller and truer. The world is not safe, and most of the time it is kind. The river had a job and it did it. The rope had a job, and it almost failed and then it didn't. The strangers had jobs they left for a minute so they could lift a dog and a man together out of a physics problem. At home, I poured water into the bowl and listened to the sound it made, the domestic twin of the river's voice. And it was the most beautiful sound I had ever been given for free. Max slept with his paw over his eyes, too fancy to look at me while he forgave me. Weeks later, when the scar on my arm had quit complaining and turned instead into a pale comma on a paragraph of skin, we returned to the river. I told myself it was to train caution, to make stay a word with teeth. But it was also to make peace with the place where the story had almost ended. The bank had fixed itself in the way banks do, not healed so much as settled for a new shape. Wildmint had decided the scar was a proper place for green. The fisherman was there again, and he lifted his chin in acknowledgement, as if we were veterans of the same unspoken thing. Max sat when I told him to, and he sat when I didn't tell him to too, as if he had learned that the ground can lie and that stillness has its own courage. The leash lay looped loosely between us, a bright piece of nylon lazily drawing our fates together. The river, chastened or bored, glittered as if innocence were a party trick it could perform on command. We stood there for a long time, not talking because the world was doing it for us. The wind moved through the reeds like a hand through hair. A dragonfly wrote hieroglyphs over the surface no one would ever translate. Somewhere far upstream, water made decisions we would feel next week. Somewhere downstream, somebody's laundry would smell briefly like silt and sky. Max leaned into my leg, not with panic's frantic pressure, but with gratitude's gentle possession. I scratched behind his ear and felt the small old bump where he once tangled with a fence. We are all a collection of places our bodies have argued with. The river said something in a lower voice, and I nodded because for once I understood. That night, when the house surrendered its day noise and the refrigerator hummed the chant it always has, Max did the thing I had wanted since the clinic, since the rope, since the cough. He snored. It was a small, ridiculous sound, a saw cutting something delicate, a sound that insisted the world could be ordinary again. I lay there and watched the window darken and lighten, and darken again, with the passing of cars and clouds, and thought how rescue is not pulling someone out, it is staying with them afterward while the river in their lungs decides to leave. It is learning where to stand, how to hold still, how to move when movement is required. Months later, a storm came without threats and left without apologies. I walked with Max under a sky that had a bruise fading in it. We visited the place where the bank had given way and the mint had turned to a small fragrant crowd. Max sat because he does now, because sitting is, for him, a way of honoring the water that might still be serious. I took the leash in my hand and noticed how light it was and how heavy it had been. We stayed and listened. We stayed and remembered without letting memory become a trap. We stayed until the river was no longer a wound, but a story we could tell without shaking. On some days, when the house is empty and the winter sun throws itself through the blinds with desperate cheer, I see Max sleeping, and the scar on my arm itches faintly, an old telegraph from an event that is now a country I once visited. I rub it absent-mindedly and think about the woman with the red shawl whose name I never learned, and the driver whose flask tasted like cinnamon, and who told me his daughter would love this dog. I think about the vet who answered the phone with his life in his voice. Love is not a feeling only. It is a city you build with strangers when the river rises. When people ask, and they do because stories travel fast where lives are close, I tell them we were lucky. They nod like I have said a prayer we all know. But later, when I am alone, I correct the record. We were loved, I say not out loud because there is no one to argue, but in that mental voice we save for sentences we want to remember. We were loved by rope and roots and hands and machines, and a woman's red shawl, and a fisherman's nod, and a mint plant's decision to turn a scar into flavor. We were loved by a river that decided, for reasons beyond my accounting, to let go. If you have ever stood at the edge of something and felt it consider you, you know the holy particularity of relief. It is not a shout. It is the breath that arrives after the one you thought might be your last. It is Max easing himself down onto the carpet and splaying out in the half-frog posture of dogs with sore hips, sighing like an old man who has found the exact chair that remembers him. It is the last light on the river, finding a way through reeds to lay a single quiet stripe across a dog's back. A small benediction that doesn't ask to be noticed and is noticed anyway. It is a leash that loosened does not fall. It is a life that, having been tugged hard by something invisible, goes on, sweeter in that subtle, ordinary way that never photographs well and does not need to. And sometimes, standing there with the water going where water goes, I find myself saying thank you out loud, not to anyone in particular, which is how I know I mean it. Max looks up, ears cocked in question, then relays the answer the only way he can. With a simple physics his body speaks better than mine, he leans. The river continues to be a river. The scar continues to be a comma. And we, who were once held in a sentence that might have ended differently, keep finding our way to the next clause. The next breath, the next small, blessed ordinary day. We came back in spring, long after the river had shed its angry winter voice, and learned to hum again. The banks were stitched with young grass, the kind that makes earth look newly invented, and the willows wore a tentative green, like a promise they were still trying on. Max trotted at my side with the big, purposeful strides of a creature that has decided to forgive the world for being the world. He had put on a little weight, the good kind that speaks of appetite and sleep, and when light touched his coat it broke into 1,000 quiet sparks. We walked with a practiced rhythm. Pause, listen, move, even though the path was already mapped under our feet. A fisherman lifted 2 fingers in greeting the way he always did, and I lifted mine back, our small semaphore of continuity. The air carried that damp, mineral scent of thawed soil, and far upstream the water glittered as if it had been rolling dice all night and finally decided to be kind. We had brought the rope, not as a dare to fate but as a habit. The way some people carry aspirin because once a heart had a strange afternoon. I had learned the knot from a video the truck driver sent me after that day, a hitch that could be paid out and retrieved even with cold hands. It was muscle memory now. Max knew the sound the rope made when I shook it loose, and his ears tipped forward, attentive but calm. I was different too. My breath arrived deeper, spread out across my ribs like a guest who meant to stay. The scar on my forearm, once an angry red parenthesis, had faded to a pale comma that caught dirt and light with equal enthusiasm. I rubbed it without thinking as we neared the place where the bank had given up last time. The earth there had learned a new edge. Mint crowded the slope. It sent a sharp sweetness that made my mouth water. A dragonfly practiced bright calligraphy a few inches above the surface, and Max watched it with the scholarly indifference of a creature that has ranked hazards. We stopped where we always stop now. A deliberate pause like the last step before a threshold. "Stay," I said, not sharply, not with the panicked exclamation point of that other day, but like an offered word that has already been accepted. He sat, and then unasked, he lay down, as if to say that the best way to respect a river is to admire it from the angle of humility. The leash, looped loosely around my wrist, made a neat line between us, a visible sentence tying subject and object. The current spoke in a lower register, a bass note under the treble of wind through reeds, and I let that layered sound pass through me the way you let forgiveness pass, slowly, not all at once, but with intent. A group of schoolchildren appeared along the path in a scatter of bright jackets, their teacher herding them without force, just suggestions, as geese herd air into V's. They were collecting leaves and measuring the width of the water with sticks that would later become rulers in stories told at dinner tables. One boy lagged a little, caught by the private gravity that tugs certain children toward edges, of rooms, of conversations, of the known. He had that luminous look of a mind folded inward. Max watched him with the composed attention he saves for small, unpredictable beings who smell like milk and paper. The boy's stick slipped, bobbing, and he reached a fraction too far, the way hands do when curiosity outruns the memo from caution. I did not shout. The word in me was ready. I've learned that careful has several dialects, but I didn't need it. Max stood, took 2 measured steps, and placed himself between the child and the river with a geometry that made my throat burn. He didn't lean his weight. He didn't block with drama. He simply arrived in the exact place where a choice becomes a habit. The boy blinked and then smiled, uncertain, as if he'd discovered a soft wall he hadn't known was there. He patted Max's shoulder, quick and light, and looked up at the teacher with the specific triumph of someone who has just made contact with an animal and found himself steadier for it. The stick went on its small solo journey. The boy stayed. The teacher thanked me, but she was thanking Max, and he accepted with the stoic politeness of a creature who senses that applause is a kind of noise that sometimes interrupts the important work of breathing. We walked on. The river widened into a lazy bend near a sandbar that hadn't existed before the winter tore and removed the banks. The sand was marked with the hieroglyphs of birds, the long commas of herons, and the nervous punctuation of smaller, braver feet. We found a dry patch and sat. Max arranged himself with theatrical care, sighing as he folded, his paws crossing at the wrists like a gentleman who has decided to take his indignation sitting down. I unpacked a thermos. Tea tasted the way memory does when it has cooled enough to be held comfortably. I poured a capful of water into a collapsible bowl, and Max drank with the serious clucks of a creature who understands now that thirst is a debt and water a form of forgiveness. A couple approached along the bank, the woman wearing a red shawl that snapped and softened in the breeze. For a second my heart stumbled because I wanted it to be her, the stranger who had looped the rope around the willow, that day with the grace of an old habit, who had lifted the hem of her shawl and run like the river had asked politely, and she had replied yes. It wasn't. This shawl had a different red, more orange in it, more sunset than pomegranate. Still, the sight of it tugged a thread, and the whole fabric of that afternoon lifted in my mind. I hoped the woman, my woman, was somewhere near this water today, unknowingly responsible for a mint patch and a knot in my muscle memory. Gratitude is the one letter you can mail without an address. We stayed until noon burned off its early shyness. A kingfisher hacked the afternoon into glittering pieces with those headlong dives that looked like joy wearing a spear. Max watched the bird's transections, eyes half closed, as if approving of a creature who understood water and fearlessness as a set. A pair of teens waded knee-deep near the sandbar, their ankles bright with sun and foolishness, and I felt the old parents tug in my ribs, though I had only ever parented dogs in grief. I was not their teacher, nor their judge. Still, when one of them drifted toward the deeper seam, I stood, not with fanfare, just with the quiet motion of someone who recognizes the border because he has crossed it. I called, "Deeper there," and the boy nodded with that brisk, embarrassed gratitude of the young who know but want to have known it themselves. The river blinked and moved on, unimpressed by my interventions. Rivers are not interested in our feelings about their physics. Yet I felt, in the ordinary way that matters, that a tiny thing had been returned a step, a hand, a breath that would not be interrupted. We turned homeward in the slanting light that makes everything look like a memory, even before it's finished happening. On the way we passed the willow with the good roots, the ones that had been someone's hands for me. I touched the bark as we went by, 2 fingers placed where rope had once made a ring of pressure. Max stopped and looked up at me, and I laughed because I had the sensation he was taking attendance. Yes, I wanted to say, present, both of us, still. At home the world arranged itself into its unremarkable greatness. The bowl clinked against the tile. The radio tried out a song and then changed its mind. We rinsed paw mud from the day's long apprenticeship in caution, and Max endured my attentions with the patience of saints and barbers. The scar on my forearm glowed faintly when wet, the way certain stones reveal their inner structure only in rain. I dried him, the big towel swallowing him up before it surrendered his outline back to the room. He shook, and the shake contained weather and seasons and a very brief imitation of the river's own grammar. Droplets flew, the kitchen window threw them back as tiny suns. He leaned into me afterward, not from fear or need, simply because leaning is one of the languages we share. That evening I called the vet to ask about nothing in particular, which is to say I called to let him hear in my voice what had happened to his prognosis. He humored me with a weather report about a lab with a trick knee and a cat who had learned to open the treat drawer. I thanked him again, and he said the sentence all good practitioners say when we try to crown them with the laurel of miraculous. You did what you needed to do. I didn't argue. He had earned the right to be wrong about that and right about everything else. After, I sat with a notebook opened to a blank page and wrote down the rope knot steps as if they were a recipe my grandchildren might one day pretend to use. I wrote down the smell of mint at the bank, the sound the river makes when it wants to apologize but can't, the look in Max's eyes when the child's stick drifted downstream and he chose the boy. We went back often for a while, not out of compulsion, but because there is a sweetness in repeating a thing until it fits you as if you were born with it. Weather changed around us. Summer came on blunt and loud, sun drumming the surface into coins of glare. In heat the river smelled like warm tin and moss. The willows drooped like they had stayed up too late on purpose. We walked early, before the air filled with the persuasive hum of insects whose entire theology is persistence. Max collected burrs and compliments in equal measure. A white-haired man with a terrier told me about falling through ice when he was 9 and being yanked out by an uncle whose gloves smelled like tobacco and fear. A woman jogging with pink tape on her knee told me about the time her own dog had slipped a collar, how she had learned from that to double check every latch in her life. People keep their near misses in small lockets and will show them if you ask correctly. In autumn, the river wanted to be a story about light. The trees flared and then learned restraint. Every gust wrote a footnote in the margins of the path, leaves scuttling in urgent punctuation. The fisherman switched to a thicker sweater, but the same patient nod. Max's coat grew richer and his patience with squirrels grew thinner, a predictable exchange. We kept to our habits, the pause, the sit, the listening. G's rehearsed overhead with an ambition that embarrassed the G's who were not invited. Once, in a long, low fog that made the river look like it had misplaced itself, we met the truck driver again. I recognized him first by the way his voice arrived with the deep certainty of someone who has negotiated with engines. He saw Max, and his face rearranged in the specific relief men try to hide. We spoke not like heroes reunited, but like neighbors who had once lifted a heavy box together and still remembered the weight. When we parted, he did not say, "Take care," he said, "See you." And in that small refusal to close the door, I heard exactly what I needed. Winter thinned the world to essentials. The river stiffened and loosened and stiffened again, according to a timetable no one bothered to distribute. The mint slept under a skin of frost. The willows made an argument for the elegance of poverty. It was then, in the exact middle of the season's small cruelties, that the woman with the red shawl appeared, the actual one, the one whose hands had made a harness out of a moment and a trunk. I knew her by the certain way she approached water, respectful, unafraid. Her shawl was now a deep plum, winter's edit. We recognized each other the way rescued people do. Not with faces, but with a quick tilt of the heart that says, "You were there in the version of my life where it almost ended." We didn't make of it a ceremony. We simply stood and watched the river and let the names for what we felt arrive late and inexact. When she left, she touched my arm with 2 fingers right above the comma, and it felt like a period had decided to add one more clause. Gratitude again, that letter without address, found its destination anyway. One afternoon toward the end of winter, with the sun deciding to be generous for once and the wind too tired to argue, a stray pup appeared. Thin, ear torn, still carrying the dangerous velocity of hunger. He hovered at the edges, trembling with the dilemma of all stray things come closer and risk, stay away and starve. Max saw him and did not perform drama. He lowered himself to the ground and placed his head on his paws, making of his whole big body an invitation with no verbs in it. The pup crept forward in increments that looked like minutes. When he finally reached us, he licked at the corners of Max's mouth, a small act of trust that felt like a miracle too quiet for priests. I offered a biscuit. He took it delicately, as if knowing to be gentle with luck. We walked home slowly, making room for a third shadow, and I felt the full circle click softly into place. The river had taken, the river had returned, and in between we had learned how to be a bridge. People love to tell you that a story resolves. They mean it tightens its laces, salutes, walks off. But the truth is softer. Resolution is a house you come back to at different times of day and find new corners lit. On the last evening of winter, when the sky had that pale, exhausted blue of old porcelain, and the first brave insects misread the temperature and threw a rehearsal anyway, Max and I stood at our place and watched water doing its one job with a dedication that humbled every ambition I had ever temporarily owned. The rope was coiled in my pocket. My scar was quiet. The mint under the frost smelled like a rumor of summer. I felt him lean, not to steady himself, not to hold me up, but the way a sentence leans toward its final phrase when it knows exactly what it wants to say. For the first time since that day, I unclipped the leash. Max remained where he was, listening. He turned his head and looked at me, and in that brief exchange, with the river making its clean, sane music, I understood the kind of freedom worth having, the kind you can choose not to use. We stayed until the cold asked politely for us to go. As we turned, the last light threaded a single gold stripe across Max's back, the same quiet benediction I had seen once before. The world was not safer than it had been, but it was deeper, and the depth felt like a friend. We walked home with the leash slack between us, a simple bright line that neither of us needed to test, and the river at our backs sounded, for all the world, like gratitude finally finding the right language.